Good morning, St. Charles. Hi, this is Mr. Russell here with the last chunk of your notes over our 9th objective about evolution. Okay, let's get started. So far we've talked about vista, we've talked about variation, how you have to have variation within a species. If all members of the species are exactly alike, then none of them are better suited to survive and reproduce than others. Talked about inheritance, how an organism has to be able to pass its traits on to the next generation, which is how all organisms get their traits. It's kind of a fundamental thing about living things, that traits get passed to the next generation. The S in Vista is selection. All organisms reproduce way more offspring than could ever survive, and that's because nature, whether it be a coral reef or Antarctica or a rainforest, nature is a horrible, terrible, scary place where almost everybody dies. I shouldn't say everybody, almost all living things die. Not almost all, but the majority do. And since a lot of them are going to die, the ones that are the best suited are going to be the few that do survive to reproduce and pass their traits on. The T is time. It requires a long time for these things to happen. These mutations only show up every once in a while to create variation. And then you need for selection to happen over and over and over again for a change to take over and cover an entire species. So that's the time. Last class we talked about adaptation. Adaptation is what you get when V and I and S and T all happen. When given all of those things, a species will adapt to its environment. It will end up better suited than it used to be. And if it cannot adapt after being given all these things, if it can't adapt to its environment, it will go extinct. So adaptation, remember, is both the process of getting better suited to your environment, better suited to survive and reproduce, and it is also the things that come out of that adaptation. So gills if you live in the water, or wings if you want to fly through the air, those are adaptations, or great big frontal lobes like we humans have. Okay, so Charles Darwin, who we've talked about a little bit, he is considered to be the father of evolution. Okay, was a guy that lived in the mid-1800s, and he wasn't the first person to have any of these ideas, but he was the first person to formally put them forth in academic papers and in a book, okay? And he argued that living things have been evolving on Earth for millions of years. They couldn't have been made exactly like they are and just stayed that way for a few thousand years. They are changing, okay? This process is called descent with modification. Descent refers to moving through something or moving down something, and in this case we're talking about moving through time. So it started up here and we moved down through it to now. Okay, and as we descend through time, living things get modified. Natural selection forces them to change and be better suited to the environment because it is always changing. Okay, that's descent with modification. And that basically says the same thing here. Each species has descended with changes from other species over time. So all species we have today come from other species that used to be around. And some of those species that were around before may still be around, and some of them may have gone extinct. So there's this constant renewal of species, new ones being created, old ones going extinct. It's a normal part of the life cycle here on Earth. Okay, this also implies that if you look back far enough, all living things are related to one another, and that's a huge idea within evolution, and also one of the more controversial things, because a lot of people do not like the idea that they have a same ancestor as their dog, or as a tree growing outside, or the athlete's foot that makes their feet itch. Okay, but according to evolution and according to so much of the evidence that we're found that we're going to talk about in this video, all living things are related. Okay, and they all, you can think of it as a big tree of life where all of the groups of living things are off on the branches. Here is a phylogenetic tree. I know this doesn't look much like a tree, but it does have a trunk. That's this little thing here. And then things split off and get more and more varied as you move to the outside. All of these things around the outside are major groups of living things. In the middle, you'll see some things you're actually familiar with, like plants, fungi, animals. That's what you are, at least I hope so. Bacteria, and then a few things that are a little less known, and, well, frankly, things I'm not really going to go into right now because they're not that important to us. So anyway, you'll see these major groups, and we start out with one thing. This one thing in the middle here was the original, this was the ancestor, the single-celled thing that all things broke off of. And you'll see that it broke into two sections here. One section went into the Euryarchaeota, which are like some really primitive bacteria that we still have some kinds of around today. They're not considered true bacteria, is why they're not in this green category. And then if we follow it down here, you'll see it breaks off into other things. Okay, so the earlier two things split apart, the earlier, or I guess the less related they are. But what this shows you is that if you move towards the middle, all things come back together and they are interrelated. Okay, so let's move on to our types of evidence, and we'll talk a little more about this later on. Okay, the first of the four types we need to talk about are the fossil record. Okay, and the fossil record just means the record of all the fossils we have. So all the fossils people have ever dug up and classified, or maybe they couldn't classify and are trying to classify to figure out what they are, that's the fossil record. And if we look at that, we see a lot of interesting things, patterns over time and things like that, and they tell us a lot about how living things have developed over time. Okay, first of all, a ton of the things we see fossils of are extinct. Dinosaurs. Fortunately for us, we do not see them running around here on Earth trying to eat us or accidentally step on us or competing with us over the food we eat. Okay, they have gone extinct, but we still find remains of them in the fossil record. Okay, you'll see this term extant periodically. This is the opposite of extinct, basically. You'll notice it's not extinct, it's extant. Extant means that it is a living species. Humans are an extant species, and hopefully we will continue to be that way. Okay, first kind of fossil we want to talk about are called transitional fossils. A transition, as we've discussed before in this class, is a change from one thing to another. So a transitional fossil shows how one thing changes from one organism, an older ancestor, into something that came later on. So it's kind of a stepping stone in between the two. Here's a great example of transitional fossils. These are various fossils that have been found at different periods of time. They haven't been discovered at different periods of time, but they've been found at different depths beneath the Earth's surface. And that shows the older they are, obviously, the further down you will find them. Down here you have a modern whale. This should look somewhat familiar. This great big mouth, that's because they have baleen in there. They filter feed. But as we go up, we're heading back in time. And you'll notice most of these are pretty complete skeletons. This one here is missing some bones. But there's certain things that you find, especially about the skull of these organisms, where they have a lot in common, especially the way the neck connects to the skull is a big thing. And we see lots of similarities between these skeletons. Even though the top one and the bottom one don't really look very much alike, they do have a few similarities. But if you look at them through this transition, so these three in the middle here are transitional fossils. They show us how a species changes over time. Okay, really cool example here. You can see the pelvis and hind limb down here at the bottom, and the one above it, they're there, but they're a little bit bigger. And then the top three, they're actual legs which function as walking. So transitional fossils show you how a certain living thing has changed over time by showing you a series of skeletons that show you certain things in common. Okay, so those are transitional fossils, and they show you how a living thing has transitioned over time. Okay, cool example of this. This little guy here in the middle is often referred to as the missing link, and his name is Tiktaalik, which is fun to say. And he has a lot of things in common with both this Eusthenopteron, which is obviously something that lived in the ocean. It's got fins. And it's also got a lot of things in common with this Ichthyostega, which scientists, from what they found so far, they think this is the first vertebrate, the first thing with a skeleton that actually came out of the water and lived on land. So there's a lot of things about their skeleton that are very similar. And there's things that are similar between this and this, but for a long time, scientists couldn't find this missing link. They couldn't find this transitional fossil that went in between. So once again, there's various things about the skull that have a lot of similarities here. And a big part of this is also the bones in this front appendage, which here is a fin, and here is, I don't know, something between a leg and a fin. And then up here it is a leg, but there's a lot of similarity in those bone structures. Okay, so Tiktaalik is an example of a missing link, and that's a transitional fossil that we couldn't find at first, but then more digging and more research, I shouldn't say we, scientists, paleontologists were able to find that and provide this missing place in the history of these living things. Okay, relative dating is not some weird form of incest. Relative dating is just to see how old something is based on where it is compared to other fossils. So this diagram kind of shows you this. Remember, the deeper we go, the older it is. So that shows us these things right here have to be younger than these things here. And if we find a layer of sediment that is real similar to this underground, but it's in a different place in the world, and we also find these kinds of things, that would suggest to us that comes from the same time period because it's a similar sediment, similar layer in the rock with similar fossils in it. Okay, and that's basically called superposition, and that's just this idea in geology that if it's closer to the surface, it must be newer. If it's further from the surface, deeper, then it must be older. Cool example of this, we've talked a little in class about the Skeleton Coast. So this place in northwest Africa, where pretty close to, when I say pretty close, I mean within 1,000 miles of the ocean, you have this really dry desert, and you find whale fossils in the middle of the desert. And these things are very, very similar to extant whales, the whale species that we have today. You can see the spine, so there was a tail there, and we have its front flippers, and then this great big skull which held baleen, which is what they used to filter feed, just like Nemo got caught up with in Finding Nemo. Okay, so that is relative dating to see how old things are based on where they came from. So if something's deeper underground, it must be older. If it's not as deep, it must be newer. Number 2 on our list of 4 kinds of evidence we're going to talk about is structure of extant species. So these are the things we see on living organisms. Okay, and the first one we want to talk about are homologous structures. Actually, I guess that's the only one we're going to talk about. We left analogous structures out of this conversation. Homo, we've talked about before, is a prefix that means the same. So these are the same or similar structures you find in different species. Really cool example of this is the forelimb or the front appendage, these things that you find in most vertebrates. So we have a human arm, a cat's front paw, a whale's front flipper, and then a bat's wing. All vertebrates, all things that have skeletons. And you'll notice a similarity in the bone structure. And you have basically the same thing up here too, a penguin's wing, an alligator's front limb, bat wing, human arm. You have one bone at the top. In humans, that's a humerus. And they're all shaped a little bit differently, but they are all very similar, obviously. Then you go down to the forearm, this part of your arm. You have 2 bones. In humans, they're the radius and the ulna. You'll see you have 2 bones here in a cat. You still have 2 bones in a whale, even though they're basically fused together into one. But you do see some differentiation between the 2. You have 2 bones here in this middle part of a bat's wing. And then we have some round bones here in the middle, which are in your palm in a human. And you have them in all those limbs. And then you have basically the different bones that make up the fingers. Now, all of these things, when you think of your hand, you use it for one thing. Basically, you grab things with it. That's what humans use their hands for, is to grasp. Cats can't grasp. Whales can't grasp. And bats can't grasp. They use their appendages for different things. Bats use them to fly. Whales use them to steer through the water. And cats use them just for walking around on them. So they have very different functions, grasping, walking, swimming, flying, but they all have similar bone structure. This is a great example here. My favorite is the whale, just because I love whales. Whale flippers are flat if you look at them from the outside, but if you were to take the skin and flesh off of one, you would find what look a whole lot like fingers in there, even though whales can't grasp things. They can't move those, but they're still in there. So that is a homologous structure, when you have similar structures in organisms. And what this suggests, and something we're going to come back to over and over again, is that these things have to have a common ancestor. They have to be related if you look back far enough. Otherwise, these bone structures don't make any sense. Where else would they come from if they serve totally different purposes? Why would we have similar bone structures? So, strongly suggest common ancestry. All right, vestigial structures are the next kind of extant species we're going to talk about. A vestigial structure is one that an organism does not use. You may have heard of your appendix. Some of you may have even had your appendix removed. That is usually considered to be a vestigial structure. There's some doctors that still argue that it has some function. We're just able to survive without it because you can have it removed if it bursts, if it gets infected. That's an appendicitis. You can still have it. You can still survive after having it removed. Cool example here is we have the pelvis and the femurs in a whale. Whales, as you can probably guess, do not do any walking. And that is what organisms that have a pelvis and leg bones, they use them for walking. And in a whale, they are just hanging out in the middle of their muscle tissue. They are not connected to anything. They're not connected to the spine. You don't see them from the outside, but they are there. So that's a vestigial structure, and that's because their ancestors had them. Just because you don't use it anymore doesn't automatically mean it just disappears instantly. It takes time for those things to disappear through evolution. This cave salamander, you'll see this little spot. He has an eye spot, which is a non-functioning eye. It's still an eye, but he can't see with it. And that's because at some point his ancestors crawled into a cave, which is pitch black, totally black, which means it doesn't matter how good your eyes are. They are not going to do you any good in there. And because eyes are big and complicated, they take a lot of energy to develop. And so you need to, you really need, it's an advantage, I guess I should say, it's an advantage to get rid of them because then you're not wasting energy developing them. And you see this in fish and insects that live in caves as well because they have no need for eyesight. A lot of times over time, they will their eyes will start to disappear. You'll also notice this guy doesn't have any kind of camouflage. He's basically clear, and that's because his predators can't see in a cave anyway, so there's no reason to have camouflage. Okay, a few more examples here we talked about. In humans, I already mentioned an appendix. Your wisdom teeth, a lot of people have to have them removed. That's because the human jaw is actually shrinking over time. Our ancestors ate a lot of raw materials, like a lot of vegetation that required a lot more chewing than we do now. And so they needed those extra teeth. We don't need them. And because of that, our jaw has actually shrunk over the last few thousand years. And definitely even the last few hundred years too. And there's not enough room for those teeth. And that's why you have to get them chopped out. Okay, here's another cool example. Kind of like the whale, snakes, some snakes still have the remains of a pelvis and a femur, which are things you use for walking. Snakes do not walk, they slither. So it's a vestigial structure because they have no use for it anymore. It's just left over there because they got it from their ancestors. So that suggests, because of this, they don't look very similar, but they're in the same place and they do have certain similarities. So it suggests common ancestry between anything that has a pelvis and a snake. All right, our third type of evidence is embryology. That is the study of embryos. Here you have models of little human embryos, okay? And because when you look at the embryos of a lot of living things, especially vertebrates, which we're pretty closely related to, compared to how closely related you are to a plant or a bacteria, you see a lot of similarities, and that also suggests common ancestry. And I have some good pictures of that here. So we have a fish embryo developing, and a salamander, and a tortoise, and a chicken, and a rabbit, and a person. Okay, and these are just drawings, but if you look at photographs of them, you'll see the same thing too. First of all, you'll notice at the beginning that we all look really, really similar, all these living vertebrates. And we all have gill slits, and I don't know about you, but I do not have any gills back here. But at the very beginning, when I was just a little adorable seahorse-looking cluster of cells, I did start to develop gills, and then as I got older, they disappeared. So you'll see as these embryos get older, they start to look like what they are. This is looking more like a chicken. This is looking more like a tortoise. But in the beginning, all vertebrate embryos look very, very similar, which once again suggests common ancestry, that we have an ancestor that's the same as all of these living things. You just have to look back a long way. Okay, the last type of evidence, and the most important, the best, the most scientific, is DNA, which we've talked about a lot, right? It's the entire story of life. The instruction manual for all living things is written in DNA, okay? And that means everything. You, your dog, your pet salamander, the grass growing in your yard, the bacteria living in your intestines, all of them have DNA that are instructions for coding them. Okay? And so the fact that we all have it, this is the one thing that absolutely all living things have, is DNA. Okay? And you can compare how much DNA organisms have in common to see how closely related they are. Okay, humans share about 99.9% of their DNA with each other. So you and me, or you and somebody living in El Salvador, have 99.9% of the same DNA. So when you sequence it out, you look at all the A's and T's and C's and G's, about 99.9% are the same. You and a chimpanzee have 97% of the same DNA. You and a dog have about 75% of the same DNA. You actually have about 50% of the same DNA with a banana tree or a fruit fly, which you may not think are very similar to you, but you have about half of the same instruction manual as them. Okay, and it's a little less known, but depending on the kind of bacteria, you may have as much as 30% of your DNA in common with single-celled bacteria. Okay, so the more DNA that you and another organism have in common, the more closely you are related. If you have an identical twin, then you have 100% of the same DNA. All right, your non-identical brothers and sisters will have a whole lot of DNA in common with you, more than I have in common with you. But you and I still have at least 99.9% of our DNA the same. So all the variation that happens between different humans is all within this 1/10 of 1% of DNA. So when you look at all these things, they suggest common ancestry. And that, once again, brings us back to this table, which shows how, as you move back in time, we move towards the center. You'll see that everything is related and connected. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them down on your notes or send me an email. We'll go over it in class. Thank you for tuning in.